them over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to Leading for Special Education, Legal and Ethical Issues. Obviously, in this hour, we're not going to be able to do everything, but I'm going to give kind of an overview of some things, have you read a case study of a recent case, and then discuss using the chat the legal and ethical issues you see here. And I noticed we have a number of special education folks with us, so I'm thrilled that they'll be here to add to the discussion and make it even better. So as you know, ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, and it is a complex law, but it affects all students in public schools, and it affects the 1 in 5 kids with learning and thinking differences. And the purpose of ESSA, of course, is to make sure public schools provide a quality education for all children, including students in poverty, minorities, students who receive special education, and those with limited English language skills. Obviously, we're going to talk about some applicable laws, the Individuals with Disability Act. Of course, now it's IDEIA. Districts have to provide quality for special education services, free and appropriate public education, FAPE, with an individualized education program, and the American with Disabilities Act, which requires equal access and equal opportunity to participate in public school services, programs, and activities. Obviously, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 requires equal access. Districts must provide students with disabilities a free FAPE. I'm just going to go there. But the thing we have to think about is being aware of the pandemic slide. All students were affected by the shift to virtual learning. We know that. But the pandemic slide has had an even greater effect on students with disabilities, because what we have seen is a loss of structure and routine for them, less focus during virtual learning, access to special education professionals or medical providers may have decreased, and IEP goals may not have been met. I mean, we're all pretty aware of what's happened. While the U.S. Department of Education understands that there are exceptional circumstances that happens, if a student didn't receive services after an extended period of time, that student's IEP team or appropriate personnel under Section 504 need to make an individualized determination whether and to what extent compensatory services are needed consistent with the respective applicable requirements, including to make up for any skills that may have been lost. We have to always consider here the INDU case, because we know that in INDU, the school had to pay for placement in an outside service due to the fact that the school was not able to demonstrate acceptable growth in their placement. So the parents had proven that he made more growth in an outside placement. So we have to keep in consideration when we think about possible slide from the pandemic is the INDU case and making sure we have correct placement. We want our students in the least restrictive environment. And obviously we can look at least to most restrictive. We know the most restrictive is to be hospital or residential. And then after that, we have private special or public special and self-contained, and then resource center down to general education and mainstreaming, which is what we would love to see for all of our students. One of the principles of IDEIA, of course, is zero reject, which it means there's an educational philosophy that says no child can be denied an education because they are uneducable. It's part of the Individuals with Disability Education Act, which is the main special education law that seeks to guarantee free and public education for students with disabilities. And FAPE, you know, is the right to free, appropriate public education. And all students are entitled to that and guaranteed by the Rehabilitation Act. So please post in the chat, what and where do you see the role of administration in ensuring alignment to these legal protections in the whole process? If you'll place in the chat, we'll look to see what you have to say. I agree. I agree, Melissa. The buck stops with administration. Totally. Yes, Jennifer, you are correct. And I think you're so right about helping teachers understand. And it is the role of administration to ensure all legal things are followed, especially when it comes to FAPE and LRE. Staying current, updated is extremely important. Communicating and following the law, but helping our teachers and our staff understand what that is so important. As Zachary says, I'll wait just about 30 more seconds and see what comes up. And yes, Denise, the principal has to understand the policies as well as the laws, because you're the one making sure. Geraldine, thank you. Keeping up with laws and updates, absolutely, is part of what we have to do. So thank you very much. So the difference between 504 and IEP, obviously, as you know, the IEP has specialized instruction, but they both have accommodations, making sure the accommodations are there for both groups. So the basic difference between an IEP and a 504 plan can be summed up in one sentence. Both plans provide for accommodation, but only an IEP provides for specialized instruction for students in grade K-12. However, I'm at a university, and so we are seeing more and more 504 plans coming into the university level for accommodations there, which is important if the student does not need specialized instruction, that we ensure they get 504 plans that will follow them into college. So when you think of the IEP process, at what point do you believe administrators should be helping with that IEP process? And you can stick that in the chat real quick. And as Michael says, the administrator is part of the team. And thank you, Agatha, for saying they need to be there during the whole thing. They need to be aware. They should be involved in the process, every step of the process, guiding the team in developing quality IEPs to ensure there's everything aligns to the laws. Thank you, Angelique. Share accommodations with teachers. The stories I have heard lately would curl your hair in these terms, because I have basically teachers who say that the principal comes in and gives them a stack of IEPs to sign and says, sign them. And they don't read them. They don't go over them. They just sign them, which is very, very scary. And while it may depend on the expectations of the district for administrators, as Zachary says, be present at the IEP meeting. Absolutely, because you're the one where, as someone else said, the buck's going to stop there. So when we look at the special education cycle, obviously we start with child find. We're looking for any child who might need the services, whether public or parochial or private. As long as they're in your district, you have to look for them and try to ensure they get the services they need. And then a referral, which may be made by any source, the teacher, the parent, or other individuals even. And then it moves into the evaluation cycle. And from there, it moves into the eligibility, determining the eligibility to the individualized education program, then the services and the annual review. And at one workshop that I went to recently, they were saying that actually they believed IEPs should be reviewed every 3 months. So about 4 times a year. And the timeline for referral and evaluations, obviously there's 30 school days to decide whether to evaluate the student. Then we need written parental consent for evaluation and 60 days to complete the evaluation. So I have a case study that I would like you to read. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to read it. And then we're going to talk about what are the ethical and legal issues within, it says 7, I'm going to give you 10, within this case study. If you would jot them down first on a piece of paper, and then we'll add them to the chat. So I want to give you 10 minutes now. And that is in the chat box. It's the link. So you can click on that link and it will open up the case study for you. All right. So now, what are some of the legal issues of this case? Let's do legal first, and then let's talk ethical. If you'll type those into the chat. No, the student herself was not involved. It is problematic. You are correct. Obviously, legal on predetermination, trying to change the IEP without the team is one of the huge issues here, and one I think school districts often don't realize. And you're correct, the full IEP team. Yes, Michael, it happens. I believe the parent was provided legal safeguards. Now, whether or not the parent understood the legal safeguards is another question, which becomes an ethical issue. Correct. Correct, Zachary. Anyone else? Obviously, the huge legal issue is ensuring that she has free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, and that they are not predetermining before she gets there or before she's ever placed. And as Zachary said, this is why admin and the IEP team need to be on the same. And as Denise says, it's critical for parents to understand that an advocate can attend the meeting with them. I believe there was an advocate in this meeting, not the predetermination meeting, but the original meeting. I agree, Michael. They need some IDEA training. Okay, so what ethical issues do you see here? I hope they are too. I think, although I don't know for sure, I believe the assistant principal was directed by a process coordinator to send the email first. Because I believe, although I do not know for sure, that the process coordinator believed that she should be diagnosed as ED. Thank you, Matthew. I think that is a huge ethical issue about undermining what is best for the student rather than what is best for the teachers and the assistant principal. That's a huge issue. And I agree, Bridget, totally agree. It shouldn't be on eligibility category. No, Aaron, it doesn't. I do not believe it changes the amount of money, at least not in the state I'm in. but I think it can change placement. And Kendall, yes, too often I think we're looking to make the student fit rather than creating the program. And as Mary says, Jane needs to be included in creating her support plan because she knows what she needs. She and her father both very much wanted her to come back to somewhere school, and both of them. And so by the school saying, that she should be labeled ED meant that they could have her outside the school rather than in the school. They could do alternative placement for her, which is definitely not supporting her needs. As Mary Pat said, it's not supporting her needs. Michael, I don't know where the school counselor was in all this. I'll be honest. I don't know for sure. But she was part of the original team that determined that she should be OHI, allowing her to come back to the school. And the counselor had been there trying to help her, for 2 years. So I would guess the counselor was very much for having her come back to the high school and be there where her friends were and that kind of thing. Other ethical issues? And Jennifer, I totally agree. I think part of the problem was the outside placement was out of state, and sometimes it's hard to get them involved in reintegration. But yes, to have had the outside agency be a part of discussion, at least, not predetermination, but discussion about how best to reintegrate Jane, this would have helped a great deal, I believe, and might have helped put her back into the school because they may have understood her needs better than the teachers did. Any others here? I agree, Angelique. Maybe they needed to have Zoom on. Maybe they needed to have Zoom on. Anyone else? Any other comments before we move on? Okay, I'm going to move ahead. We've done our share. So as we look at the issues around predetermination that we all talked about, that it's illegal, it's a procedural violation of IDEA that deprives parents of the opportunity to meaningfully participate in their child's IEP. And it can deny the child a free, appropriate public education, as we've seen. So what does it look like? It can take a number of forms, including when school staff complete a finalized IEP before meeting with parents. And I have heard there are some that do that and walk in with the IEP and give it to the parents and say, here it is. Or where school staff indicate that the IEP has already been decided before the meeting with the parents. Or where members of the staff or school policy indicate that there are only certain courses of actions available for the child's IEP. They sometimes complete a finalized IEP before the meeting with the parents, or they indicate that the IEP I think that's the same thing over again, forgive me, or the school reasonably refuses to schedule the IEP meeting to accommodate the parents. And with Zoom, there's really very little reason for that. I'm with Angelique. Zoom has made it tremendously better for parents to be able to attend. Or there may be unofficial school policies that prohibit certain services or placement. So some evidence of predetermination. Courts have found evidence of predetermination when A school has an unofficial policy of refusing to provide certain programs or services, or a school staff decide a child's placement before an IEP meeting and without parental input, or school administration makes its determination prior to an IEP meeting and refuses to consider alternatives, which is what just happened. And that's HB versus Las Virgenes in the Ninth Circuit. Or the school staff fails to incorporate the suggestion of the parents or listen to the parents' concerns. So all of these things are evidence of predetermination. Sometimes the school schedules the IEP meeting without inquiring into the parents' availability, and then they may not want to reschedule. I think most all schools do reschedule for parents, but I know that here in my state, if a parent can't make it to the second meeting after the first one's been rescheduled, they can move on without the parent present, which again, to me, feels like not involving the parents. So some strategies that we should be using. Be careful when writing internal memos and emails. I don't know if this is happening in your state. I guess I should ask this, but with the Sunshine Law, in my state, we are seeing a plethora of requests for Sunshine Law, all the documentation. Are you all seeing that as well? Are you being inundated with requests? Yes, yes, yes. I think we all are, unfortunately. And that takes up lots of time and lots of work to do all that. So teachers need to be informed, to be careful when writing internal emails and memos, because those become part of the record. Even phone calls from a private telephone can become part of the record. So one of the things you need to do as supervisors or teachers is to educate all the teachers about what they should and shouldn't write, even in emails, so that it helps protect them and it helps you all stay out of this immense request for sunshine information. Faculty and staff must avoid making decisions before an IEP meeting. Do you believe your teachers actually understand predetermination? No. Kelly says no. Erin says no. Cynthia says no. Carissa says no. So how can you educate them? Very few, according to Michael. How can you better educate them? They also don't understand due process, Geraldine. Okay, so let's talk about how you can help educate teachers so that they do understand due process, as well as they don't violate predetermination. Okay, let's talk, Hassan. What would be the difference between having some plans versus plans of option before the meeting that would not violate predetermination? And Geraldine says more trainings. Denise says providing high quality professional learning to all staff. It's one thing to brainstorm. Hassan says, I think it is one thing to brainstorm. It's another to railroad a single option. I agree. Training for the staff. Kelly, you know, a quick cheat sheet that would explain and adding it to the newsletters is a fabulous idea. Formal PD would be great, but even if you took a few minutes with a cheat sheet to talk about if you have special education students, please understand, we do not predetermine. We want to have the parents involved. We want everyone involved in this. So while you may brainstorm some ideas, you don't want to try to force those ideas into the IEP. And I know we've all had students that we thought we knew exactly what to do. But in this instance, in terms of predetermination, we need to be very careful, but there's nothing wrong with discussion. So be sure that internal communications reflect that no services or placement options have been selected or have been ruled out, either one. So as we look at the IEP team, we know the student is appropriate, which, as someone pointed out, Jane was not there, a regular education teacher, the school system representative, usually, okay, I've got to read here. Matthew, if principal refuses to allow education for remote instruction student to occur within the general education classroom, is this predetermination? Okay, so let's think about that, because I'm going to ask some of the rest of you to. I didn't think that was an option according to Mary. If the principal refuses to allow education for remote instruction student to occur within the general education classroom, is the I guess the question is, what's in the IEP? Does the IEP, forgive me, I'm sorry. Does the IEP say that the student will be allowed to Zoom in to a general ed classroom? No, it does not. Then I would say you need to reconvene the IEP team to review this before you, and may I ask, I don't want to overstep, but may I ask why you would determine that the student should be allowed to Zoom in? Is it because you don't believe that the student is focusing on Zoom, or is it disruptive, or what is the rationale for this? Mary, what did you mean by, I didn't think that was an option? Did you mean the principal saying you can't Zoom in, or the IEP student Zooming into the regular class? Matthew says it is not predetermination. Okay, remote student. Okay, so that's what he was supposed to do, was remote only. And it could be a denial of FAPE. Oh, okay. So the principal wants the student to come back to school and not stay remote. If I were you, Matthew, I would suggest that the IEP team reconvene, because if what they want is for the student to be back, the IEP team may know there may be a rationale as to why he needs remote services. I know, most school districts around where I live now have actually said there can only be X number of students who are on remote now, and the rest are expected to come back. In fact, most of them are expected to come back. So I would say reconvene the IEP team, which you see in front of you, the sign as to who all should be there. Okay, if your state requires all students to be in person unless they meet certain criteria, then I would say that there is a rationale as to why that student should not be remote. I would definitely reconvene the IEP team and have them relook at why, because if it's a requirement by the state, that kind of supersedes a lot of things other than extreme measures. So I would say take it back to the team and have them reevaluate where it is right now. So if we look at a program logic model as to how we're going to get where we need to go, and you think about this in terms of making sure that your special education students are getting free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, then you have to think about what is our current reality? Where do we want to improve? What does our evidence show us? And then what resources do we need to meet our goal? What activities will help us meet our goal? How will we begin taking the steps to meet the goals we want to improve? And how will students and teachers benefit? Now, before we go to questions, there's one other area I want to touch on with you, and that is the Mahoney case that the Supreme Court heard about disciplining students when there's out of school activity and they write things on social media. And the Supreme Court actually basically, this is the first one since Tinker. So this is the first one in 50 years that they've made a decision. And they held the students' right to free speech protected by the First Amendment. So if you have students who make comments on social media and they bring this up, the school cannot discipline them unless it is basically a threat or something like that. Because Mahoney decision, the Supreme Court's decision was off-campus speech, and they applied the First Amendment rights in light of the school's special interest and characteristics of the school. And the court stressed the fact that a school at times does stand in place of the parent. However, in this instance, they said that there was no threat to the school. She was expressing her opinion. She did not name anyone, any individual, so it was not focused. So 3 features of off-campus speech that often, if not always, distinguish schools' efforts to regulate off-campus speech and on-campus speech. The first is a school will rarely stand in place of the students' parents with off-campus speech. The second is, from student speakers' perspective, regulation of off-campus and on-campus speech would include all speech the student utters in a 24-hour period. And the third part was the school presented some evidence that expressed a concern for team morale, but that still did not give them enough leeway to discipline a student. And I know sometimes our special education students get on social media and write things that we think are inappropriate. However, in the balancing the levels of disruption to school is in interest of the students' First Amendment rights. That has to be a concern that we always get into when we do this. So just adding that to the whole predetermination thing and student rights and making sure that our special education students' rights are protected, even if it Okay. I absolutely agree, Kristen. All students should be in person. That is right. If they can be, versus being homebound for sure. And Michael, you're probably right. I think we have lots of administrators out there who it wouldn't hurt them to go to a few law conferences and hear, especially some of the special education issues that are arising that we see happening over and over. What kind of questions do you have for me now?
And Jody, they are free to type in the questions into the chat, or if they'd like
Yes.
to respond verbally, you can raise your hand using the icon at the bottom of your screen, and I can unmute your microphone or at least allow you to talk. So if there is something you'd like to share out verbally, just raise your hand and I will allow you to talk.
Thank you. Okay, seeing nothing, I'm going to move on to what is something you are frustrated about your school support for SPED students, and what is something you're feeling good about your school support for SPED students. So let's share, because you will learn more from each other than you do from me. So in that instance, what are some things you're feeling frustrated about, but what are some things you're feeling good about? You can type or you can raise your hand, either one. I would love to hear voices. Kelly, I don't have a resource immediately available, but I will try to find you one. And we can always, I think, follow up and send it out. And Kathy, I totally understand what you're saying. Far too often, oh, Geraldine has her hand up. Far too often, teachers feel like students aren't being successful, so they immediately want to evaluate. Geraldine.
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my frustration right now is that our special education students are sometimes left out of some of the activities and some of the things they do with our gen ed kids. They keep them separated, and we're trying to push the fact that they need to be included. So that's a big frustration right now.
And actually that's borderline on the least restrictive environment issue.
It is, and a lot of it is attributed to misbehaviors. So for our kids, not so much the ones with the academic concerns, but the students who have the behavioral concerns, people find it difficult to work with them. So they kind of just want to leave them out of things, which we're trying to work on. Unfortunately, it didn't help the pandemic and we were on remote. So now the behaviors in some cases have worsened because they were not in school. So everyone is having a difficult time transitioning back into in-person learning, but most of our special ed kids are. So that's what really makes it difficult.
And again, I think it has to do with the pandemic slide that happens. I think our students have been virtual and we're not, they didn't have the same expectations. So it's going to take a while to overcome some of those behaviors, and teachers need to understand that students were not in routines. So they really need to be patient with them, Geraldine. I know that's easier said than done.
Right.
But absolutely. I've been there. I know it's easier said than done, but the point being, it's critically important because they need to understand least restrictive environment is a law. It's part of the law and they need to pay attention to it.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And I agree, Monica. It's not about the support system but more with the sign of the pandemic times. And I think that's true. And someone said, they tell SPED teachers just to join with a grade level. I think we have gone too far without educating the educators in terms of the ethical pieces, because what Geraldine was saying to me is an ethical issue. Do we educate students to the best of our ability? And if they're keeping them out, they're not educating them to the best of their ability. So I think that it is time, and I will try to find some information, some things I can send to Arlen that he can send out to everyone. So I think that is fabulous. So what is a resource you would like to share about supporting SPED students? Do you all have some? You're welcome, Matthew. What do you have some resources that you would like to share too that people can get to? Thank you, Michael. Purposeful co-teaching, fabulous. Thank you, Matthew. It's a book, I assume. It sounds like a book. Other resources? Pre-referral intervention manual. Nice. I like that. Thank you. Books, good books.
Hey, Jody, am I unmuted?
You are unmuted, yes.
Oh, sorry. Do you mind if I say a resource?
No, Aaron, please. I'm sorry. I had my chat up and I didn't see your hand up. Go ahead.
No, I think I think one of the biggest resources I feel like in any corporation is one, talking to the director of special education, and if not getting a hold of them, always reaching out to the state director of education. I think one of ours came in and actually did a PD for all of the district administrators, and gave us more information on manifestation determinations. I think the biggest resource we had to understand was this past year was that in-school suspension, depending on if a child's receiving their services or not, counts as a day for a child receiving services. And so going through those reteachings and clarifications with the administrators too, and the administrators need to trickle that down to the teachers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And CEC has some fabulous materials that you can download that just help, and checklists for every type of meeting and protocol to agree to norms for IPS is absolutely correct. Absolutely. What about trainings? Have you had some trainings? Obviously, Aaron just shared one, and I'm sure that's probably a free resource. Any others? Total participation techniques. Yes, I think the pandemic has affected our students, absolutely. And program evaluation logic models, absolutely, because we need to look at what we're doing and what we need to change to get there. So I would suggest that you begin to think about, how do we get others involved in these discussions? How do we help everyone understand the legal issues? So I love the Albert Einstein quote. It's physics. Match the frequency of the reality you want, and you cannot help but get the reality. So since it is 4 o'clock, I'm going to stop here. I was going to have you type in what you learned, and then what are your next steps? It's kind of an exit ticket. So what is the first thing you want to do? What's something you can take back to share? Please know that my email is at the beginning of this. If you want to email me at any point in time, I am happy to share with you. So Arlen, I'll turn it back over to you. And thank you all for being here so very much.
Yes, we definitely want to thank all of our participants for joining the webinar today. And Jody, thank you so much for all this valuable and important information on the topic of special education. This webinar was recorded, and I will be sending a link to the recording out tomorrow, as well as an evaluation that once completed will give you the ISB evidence of completion form for entering your PD clock hours if you're attending this from Illinois. Go ahead and type your exit slips into the chat. Jody will hang on for just another couple minutes and review those. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to type those into the chat as well. Other than that, I'm going to stop the recording and you are free to leave this session. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.